Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Python Community News. I am one of your hosts, Jay Miller, and with me, as always,
I'm Jon Banafato.
we wanted to bring something special to the audience, which is a conversation that we've been wanting to have for a long time. Folks that have been following us back in our weekly live stream days will know that we have often talked about the security of the Python community, the security of its packages, and a lot of that starts where most Python packages start, which is PyPI. And we've name dropped this person a few times and said we should definitely have him on the show. Well, he's here for the first time. Dustin Ingram. Hey, Dustin, how's it going?
Hey guys, it's super good to see you.
Dustin, let's start it off by first giving you 3 hours to tell everybody about all the stuff that you do around the Python community.
I can't even keep track of it myself. Yeah, let me maybe just the highlights. I'm Dustin Ingram. I'm on the board of the Python Software Foundation. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about what that means. I also help maintain and administer the Python package index. And the other highlight is I work at Google on our open source security team, which isn't exclusively about Python, but one of the things that I specialize in is figuring out what security for the Python ecosystem looks like right now.
How about we first start off with kind of some history around PyPI? Because wasn't it like a cheese shop at some point or something like that?
Yeah, I think the original name for it back when I think Ian Bicking and Richard Jones had created it. This is 2013, I think, 2014. Was the cheese shop, because it's a reference to that Monty Python skit where John Cleese goes into a cheese shop and there's no cheese. So at the time they created PyPI, they created the cheese shop, but there was nothing on it, right? No one, it had to bootstrap it, right? Now we don't really call it the cheese shop anymore because there's a lot of stuff on PyPI. But there's still, some people still call it cheese shop, and that there's at least one Easter egg on PyPI that still references cheese shop. I got first involved with PyPI. Actually, we had this legacy PyPI is what we call it now. And this is what had basically originally been created. And the kind of funny thing to think about that is that legacy PyPI was created before PyPI existed. So it couldn't use any package or anything on PyPI. It was totally standalone. And so over the years, we kind of evolved that, and it kind of went, became something that was quite old in terms of web applications. So it was getting rebuilt around 2017, 2018 by Donald. He was sort of doing a full stack rewrite, and I happened to find it, and I thought it was really cool. He's doing a really nice job, but it wasn't being used yet. So I was kind of just helping get it to a point where it could become PyPI. And then Mozilla came along with this Mozilla open source support grant to the Python Software Foundation, which allowed me to work on it full time with some other folks and turn it into proper PyPI. And I just sort of became PyPI maintainer because that sort of just became PyPI.
And so this is Warehouse. And can you give us, I guess, some more context on what was the real goal of the rewrite, and I guess how that plays into some of the things that we're going to talk about today, which are really things like security, reliability, and sustainability?
Yeah, the goal of the rewrite, and this is back in 2018, I think we actually did the switch over. And, the goal was just to use modern stuff, right? Modern development practices, a modern code base, using, web frameworks and all that kind of stuff. And so it just allowed us to sort of start fresh with something that was easier to maintain. Because honestly, the biggest problem with PyPI back then, there had been a period where PyPI had a lot of downtime and outages, and I think we'd mostly recovered from that, but it was just impossible to work on. It wasn't fun to work on in order to get it running. I remember I did very briefly make some changes to old PyPI, and even to get it running locally, you had to comment out huge chunks of it because it just wasn't set up to do that. So now we have something that runs in a Docker container and runs locally and has all these nice services and uses task queues and all this. It's a lot nicer to use now. So it sort of unblocked a ton of stuff that we wanted to do with it, because now it's actually nice and reasonable to develop it.
That's interesting, and not something that I've thought too much about. I know that there are products. I think the one that most comes to mind is JFrog, where they advertise, hey, if you want to run your own private PyPI, are they effectively just giving a shippable version of what y'all are running at a much smaller scale?
Well, so to be clear, what they are running is not a PyPI. PyPI is actually a trademark, and it only refers to the service that the PSF runs. So they'd be running we call it a package index or a private index. And yeah, I think to answer your question, like, are they running the same code base? The answer is no, because there's like a small set of requirements to run a package index, right? And actually the APIs and standards to do that are literally called the simple API, and they're fairly easy to implement. Everything else in that code base that is warehouse is like what it takes to be PyPI, like PyPI at scale, PyPI with everything else that needs to happen. So I think in the past couple of years, I've seen folks sort of come along and be like, oh, this looks really cool and nice and it works well and it's modern and like I'm going to use this for my private index thing. But there's just so much to it that's like overcomplicated or overbuilt just because there's stuff that we need to do to be PyPI that they don't need, that it's not actually feasible. So usually we recommend like PyPI, the code base is not for standalone, do your own index kind of things. It's really just for being PyPI.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying on that. You've talked about all of those things that are required for PyPI to run. What is the overall cost of running? Maybe not in exact dollars and cents, but like what's the time frame of maybe a feature being added? How many people are often working on this? From what I can tell, PyPA, the Python Packaging Authority, isn't necessarily like this business as much of it is like a rad tad band of plucky misfits like trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, well, PyPI is a bit of an exception in terms of PyPI projects because it is a very important and critical service, and it is owned and operated by the PSF. So PSF sort of takes authority over it in a way, and there are a fair amount of folks that work on it. We have a handful of moderators and a couple of maintainers. And who's the director of infrastructure at the PSF, does work. Technically, PyPI is part of their full-time work, so they are available for like outages and things like that. And that's kind of, myself, I spend a lot of time sort of doing a bit of like project management and a bit of coding and bug fixing and things like that. A lot of time in the issue tracker and doing support stuff for PyPI as well, which lately has been consuming a lot of my time. But yeah, we in terms of costs, like I think it probably occupies just a fraction of E's time in terms of maintaining the service. It kind of runs on autopilot most of the time. And then, users come along with questions and feature requests, and we work towards that. Stuff moves at the speed of open source, right? Like, unless we have funding for projects, we don't, move super quickly usually. That said, we've been really good about finding ways to get funding for features and kind of critical stuff. And those tend to move pretty well. Like we'll, in the past, have hired project managers and had folks working full time on a certain feature or improvement. And we're actually about to launch a couple stuff that got built pretty quick. And I was pretty impressed with how fast it rolled out, and really going to substantially change PyPI and the sustainability model there, hopefully in the future. So excited to see that. And then like in terms of infrastructure, it really depends on what you consider to be costs, right? Because we get a lot of stuff for free, which is nice. We have a lot of incredible in-kind donations from our sponsors that help keep PyPI online. And they've changed over the years, but some have been really consistent as well. But yeah, if we're paying market rate for that stuff, PyPI would be like in the order of more than $2 million a month to keep online, which is not an expense that PSF is really prepared to shoulder right now. So, in terms of costs, like one of the costs is keeping those sponsors and making sure that they see the value and keep PyPI online and keeping those cloud credits flowing.
And so we talked about the changes from the cheese shop to warehouse in 2018, and that brings us forward to some pretty big changes that happened, more recently in 2022. Can you give us a brief overview of some of the things that were added to PyPI last year?
Yeah. So we're kind of at a point, and I think we kind of got there in the last couple of years, where PyPI is a great service and it works really well. We have tons of people using it, publishing to it, and consuming from it. And we kind of coasted along on like everyone is treating PyPI well for a long time, and didn't have to think too much about stuff going badly. But um, not that anything in particular has happened to PyPI, but sort of broadly in the software ecosystem, it's been more malware attacks and more like infrastructure attacks, and maybe not really more, but more scrutiny and like more high profile stuff, and just a lot more interest in improving things. So we have definitely been spending more time focusing on security related stuff just across the Python ecosystem, not just PyPI recently. I think the big thing last year that most people will remember is that we got a bunch of two-factor authentication security keys, and we tried to give them out to as many maintainers as we could. And it was a little bit bumpy for a minute. At the end, we got a ton of people to turn on two-factor, which is really important, like long-term for PyPI sustainability. And we also just gave a lot of hardware keys away, which are generally considered a little bit more secure than just the authenticator apps on your phone with TOTP.
And pretty briefly for our listeners who don't know a lot about two-factor authentication, what is the real goal here in term for someone who just uses Python?
Yeah, so I mean the goal is for someone that just uses Python, like if you're just installing, you're not like a maintainer, you're not publishing, the goal is to make sure that what you're installing remains secure, like that you don't get compromised someday. So our goal was actually to focus on what we call critical packages, and we define this as the top 1% of stuff on PyPI. The kind of secret to that number is that top 1% of projects on PyPI accounts for like 90 something percent of the traffic. So it actually, in terms of impact, like if one of those things were to get compromised, it would be pretty big. And so the idea is by enabling two-factor, two-factor like anywhere else, we reduce the potential for individual accounts getting compromised. And that could be a number of ways, right? Like someone used their password somewhere else and it got leaked, or someone, got phished. That was a pretty common one. That's actually happened to users on PyPI before. And these things can result in someone gaining access to an account, publishing something nasty, and then downstream users who had no idea that any of this was happening, getting compromised.
So speaking of these compromises, you actually were, gracious enough to provide some stats over the last, 6 years. And I think this is what really led us to like, okay, Dustin has the numbers. We need to talk to him. Let's talk about what the landscape looked like in 2017 when there were a devastating 38 projects removed.
Well, now we're talking about malware, right? So yeah, there's kind of two things that, like, nasty stuff on PyPI kind of falls in a couple categories. So, if someone is compromised and two-factor happens, like, or as a result of not having two-factor, I should say, like, that compromise is sort of one class of like, this is some legitimate project that something unintended has been published to, and that's a big deal. It doesn't happen very often for PyPI. It has happened, but not very often. The other class that you're kind of talking about is like the downside to PyPI being so open and accessible and like allowing anyone to publish to it, which is that anyone can publish to it, and people publish all sorts of junk there. So sometimes that stuff is just like kind of spammy looking or useless. Sometimes that stuff, it could be actively harmful, but requires you to install it for it to be harmful, right? So yeah, I think you're referring to a tweet where I was trying to like get a sense of how much malware I'd taken down this year, and I went back a little bit and looked, and like the malware has really kind of ticked up for us in the last couple of years. We went, I think, from 38 malware reports. I mean, there was even a period when we didn't keep track of malware that we took down because it was so infrequent, and we didn't have tools to take down stuff like that. We just sort of did it manually. Now it's sort of like we have a pretty good process for doing it. A whole team of security researchers, third-party folks that send us reports and work with us to figure out why stuff is bad and where it's coming from, and do it quickly. So yeah, we've taken down a lot. I don't know. I forget what the number was last year. It was a lot. I think it was more the year before though, right?
It was. So I got the numbers here. We'll start with 2020, which was the first significant jump. You went from, hundreds to under 100 to 500 projects taken down. And then 2021, but it was like 27,000 projects removed. And 2022, there was a decrease, but it went from 27,000 down to 12,000. I mean, 500 to 27,000 just sounds absurd. Like, what were you actively working to remove some of these during that time? And if so, do you remember what that was like?
I would guess I took down the majority of those. Definitely in the last year, like I think I figured out like 80% or more was me, and the rest was E taking down the rest. Yeah, I think that big bump, that was folks discovering this type of attack called a dependency confusion attack, which is something that might happen in the Python ecosystem when you're using software both from PyPI and from a private index or some third-party index, where you might be installing something from one index, and then if an attacker figures out the name of that project, goes and registers it on PyPI, then you could potentially be installing their library instead of the one that you meant to, and it all gets messed up. So there was a ton of stuff getting registered around that time because people were trying to collect bug bounties and compromise big companies, and there's a couple successful examples of this as well. Yeah, I think most of that came from that period.
You mentioned in your tweet that as that number reduced, it went from being that dependency confusion attack to now mostly just being straight up malware. How do you even find like how do you know when it's malware? Like who's doing that detection?
Like when you see it, Yeah, I mean,
you don't have a computer that you're just like trying each like package one by one to see what happens.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't want to give like too much away, but we have there's a whole bunch of folks that are security researchers, legitimate security researchers, work for various companies, and they're kind of just in the business of being able to detect bad stuff, and so they kind of leverage that ability to essentially scan everything that's been uploaded to PyPI and find some bad patterns. So yeah, I don't know exactly what they're doing. I do know what some of them are doing, and some of them, do exercise the code and run it in a sandbox and do this and do that. Some of it's just like really powerful regular expressions, and those actually are fairly successful at finding stuff. But yeah, when you see it, like this stuff, I think like lately it seems like the main way to get compromised via PyPI is someone in a Discord saying, "Hey, will you help me debug this thing? Will you pip install like request spelled backwards or something like that?" And then you copy and paste it and do it. Like that, I think that's kind of the model of attack that's happening right now, which is pretty, I don't think a lot of legitimate Python users, maybe not legitimate is the wrong word, a lot of like production grade Python users are not getting compromised by this stuff, right? It's folks that don't really know what's happening when someone says, "Hey, type this into your terminal, let me know what's happening." They're getting hoodwinked, right? And also, most of it seems like the target is cryptocurrency stuff, like trying to get Discord tokens into other Discord channels, trying to get crypto wallets, that kind of thing. Seems to be the primary focus. So, yeah, we take down a lot of stuff. I don't think that necessarily maps into a whole lot of impact on the average is a better word, average Python user. But yeah, it's definitely probably impacting someone at some time. So we try to be quick with it.
And so would that scale up from 500 to 27,000? What is the level of kind of effort that takes from you and E and other folks who are working on really protecting PyPI as the communal resource it is?
Yeah. So we're kind of working on responding to that increase in scale. I think we have a plan for how we're going to do it. Right now, our process doesn't scale quite as nicely as I'd like. So it's basically email. People email us reports, and we click links, and we look at the code, and we verify it. And we've done a lot of stuff to make that process a lot easier. Like I wake up and have a bunch of stuff in my inbox, and I go click through things, and it's a pretty, it's like a couple seconds for me to look at a report, figure out, all right, is this actually happening or not? At this point, I can just like glance at a source file and tell if it looks like malware or not. It's pretty easy to figure it out. But then like do the thing that only I can do, which is like actually remove something off of PyPI, which is, we depend a lot on the volunteers to give us the reports. It's hard to depend on volunteers to take that step, because that's like, it's a lot to give someone permission and just wipe anything off the face of PyPI. So, we kind of retain that as administrators as our duty, but otherwise, we're currently working on a couple of projects to get funding to do some nice things about making this whole pipeline a lot faster and easier. And it's kind of funny because like I look at it and I'm like, oh, this needs a lot of work. And then we talk to our researchers who work across many other ecosystems, and they're like, you guys are the fastest, or like, you guys are the most responsive. I'm like, really, are we? Because this is janky. I don't know.
Oh man. Well, in that instance, even, being responsive often comes at a cost. And when I think about what you do in your day to day, just as someone who's a Googler, and you work in security at Google, does that play a part of some of the speed? Is what we're seeing the same attacks that you might see across other ecosystems? Are I mean, we just saw earlier, I think it was late December, there was an attack that basically people had said they've never seen anybody do this, when it comes to the Python ecosystem. They've seen it in other places, but they haven't seen it in the Python ecosystem. So do you think that a lot of your ability to solve these problems comes from your experience as a security professional outside of the Python space as well?
I think so, but like a lot of my security experience just comes from being in the Python ecosystem for a long time. So it actually really hasn't been until recently that I've kind of, in the last couple of years, really branched out, just working in some of these other ecosystems as well. And I really owe a lot of credit to folks from those other ecosystems that we collaborate with like very regularly. I work. I chair this working group in the Open Software Security Foundation, which is a new foundation that's nonprofit and just focused on software security. And we have a working group there. It's about securing software repositories. And so we got folks from NPM, RubyGems, Maven, or not Maven, but Sonatype and Maven Central. Crates, folks show up all the time. Like every ecosystem comes there, and we all sort of talk about stuff because we have so much in common in terms of like the problems that we have with running a software repository. And it's been really helpful. We've really learned a lot from each other as a result of that. And we're sort of like trying to move towards doing some really similar stuff in step with each other as well, and support each other through that as well. So that's been really good. But yeah, I think like, I have an interesting perspective here because I have a deep love and knowledge of the Python ecosystem, but also like I got this high level view of like what is happening in open source security broadly, like everywhere, like in the US policy, in Europe's policy, in what all these different ecosystems are doing, all these new technologies that are coming out trying to fix certain things that are like still kind of underground. They aren't mainstream. They're not super in use right now. So part of my job is like knowing and understanding how those things work and figuring out if and how they'll work for the Python ecosystem and bringing them into the ecosystem to fix issues that we might have, or to make this ecosystem more resilient, more sustainable, that kind of thing.
And so my next question is going to seem like I came up with it after some recent news, but I asked you this a few weeks back. Right, you talk about the volunteer aspects around reporting vulnerabilities, but giving permissions to actually take things down is a huge next step. Right? Does paid support staff help in that regard?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the one thing that we've sort of realized in the last couple of years with PyPI is that there's so much work to do here that A, has to be someone trusted. B, it's not fun work. It has to be someone paid. It's stuff that we can't ask volunteers to do. I think I made a joke in the tweet that's like trying to get free dental work. Like, do you really want that guy that like wants to drill in your head for free to do the job? Probably not, right? You want someone that's professional, someone that you pay and can trust. And so I think for PyPI and the Python ecosystem in general, like moving towards a path where we have folks that are trusted because they work for us and we've vetted them and it's their job to do this, and giving them that responsibility, I think, is a little bit more sustainable than just waiting for volunteers to take care of it, or it just falling on whoever it has the highest level of permission, that kind of thing.
And so what is the PSF doing on that front of paid security work?
Yeah, so it's kind of two fronts. One is something we've been practicing for a while, which is finding, sort of doing a good job of describing our problems and the projects and why they could be funded and what fixing them would result in, finding people that are willing to fund it, and then following through on that, hiring contractors, hiring project manager, building a roadmap, planning the features, and then getting it done. So that's something we've done a couple times with certain things. That's why PyPI has two-factor authentication now. That was a funded project that we landed, hired contractors, built it, boom, done. The other thing is just actually hiring staff. So we have, he's director of infrastructure. We have another infrastructure staff right now. But yeah, we're working towards hiring. And I think what you're alluding to is we just announced the OpenSSF, which I mentioned before, has funded a role at the PSF that's going to be the developer in residence for security developer in residence. And this is sort of kind of mirroring success with the CPython developer in residence, which is Łukasz Szalanga and has been for the last 2 years. That was a role that also, I was instrumental. I got Google to originally fund that role as well. So, I think I'm biased. I think this is a really good model, but getting these roles developed, getting them funded by our sponsors, by our community, and then making sure that it's like full-time sustainable work. Like we pay Łukasz a salary that's, I hope, reasonable for him as a software engineer, right? He used to work for Facebook. So I hope he finds working at PSF all right. But not paying, a couple bucks of coffee money via sponsors or whatever, but like really treating it like a full-time role, having people work full-time.
Is one person, plus the small staff that already exists, is that enough? I mean, if that's
baby steps. PSF is, it's an organization that's been around for a while. It's pretty bare bones. Like we make a lot. We do a lot with the little that we have. We are a nonprofit. Like it's like any other nonprofit. It can always do more with more money, and we're always looking for more. But I do think like the PSF staff there, and especially the executive director, Deb, who we just hired a couple of years ago, it has been really great and like making this a focus, growing staff, looking for partnerships and funding with large corporations and things like that really do care about the Python ecosystem, and is making it a reality because the long-term sustainability of being able to hire staff, give them benefits, have them work on CPython full time is so much better than a cadre of volunteers who like come in and out as they have time, right? Having one person like Łukasz just dedicated and focused on it, even if it is just one person, I think is a really significant improvement over what we had before. I hope all the CPython developers would agree with that. And so I hope to see the same for security. And yeah, I mean, we would love to grow this. Obviously, it depends on funding and that kind of thing. But we'd love to see more examples of this.
In terms of funding, is this the same funding that covers, Python community grants and other areas? Like, is most of this funding coming from the same contributions that people make to the PSF, or are there other ways to provide that funding?
Yeah, PSF has kind of 3 primary sources of revenue. So one is PyCon. PyCon brings in a decent amount of funds for the PSF, and those are kind of general purpose funds. People at nonprofits don't like to talk about the fact that a lot of funding goes to paying staff salaries because it's not an interesting thing to be a donor and say, all right, I paid that person's paycheck, but that's the reality. So PyCon helps keep PSF staff and all that kind of stuff going. The other kind of area of funding is individual donations, and that's a small percentage of what we get, but they do help, and those also kind of go in general fund. And then there's donations in terms of cash, like from our sponsors. So this is a mix of like foundation sponsorships, that's funding that goes, sponsors get like stuff at PyCon as a result. They get logos in places, that kind of thing. But those funds just sort of go wherever. And then we have like one-off funding things from various sponsors. So they might come in and fund a very specific project because they really want to see this thing happen. And that's something we want to make happen, right? Like we have such a large stakeholder in our ecosystem. They really need this thing. Like if it's reasonable, we should be able to deliver it. And so that's kind of what we've been working on lately.
And to focus on one of those topics, you mentioned individual donations. I think that's really where most of our listeners are going to fall into categorically. And so what else can the community at large do to really help, right, with securing Python, right, whether that's toward PyPI or in their own organizations, things like that.
Yeah, I think one of the things people can do to help. So you mentioned like individual donations. I love it when people donate to the PSF. I think there is something I would rather have people do if they were choosing between what to do. And that's and you get this for free if you donate to become a supporting member. But become a member of the PSF and vote in our elections. Like ensure that your actual voice is getting represented when we make decisions about who is leading the organization. I think we've done a pretty good job. I think we could do a better job. And I'd love to see a lot more of the Python ecosystem kind of engaged and focused on the stuff that happens at the top, like where these decisions are being made and who's making them. To be clear, like everyone on the PSF board is really amazing, but I have this feeling in my gut that like we're not really always going to be able to catch everybody's needs and desires. And the better representative we are of that ecosystem, the better we're able to do that, and the better we're able to serve the ecosystem, right? So yeah, lots of ways you can become a member. You can, like we were talking about before, you can make an individual donation. You can become a sustaining member. You can become a supporting member, which means that you just volunteer your time, and it's sort of on the honor system that you give so many hours a week, and you can get voting rights and lots of other stuff too. So that's what I'd push for. And then, just broadly, like have an understanding that sometimes it's hard to discern, because I think we've done a good job, but there's a big difference between a giant corporation when you're on github.com that's running that service, and when you're on PyPI.org, which is a tiny little nonprofit with a handful of staff and volunteers and mostly volunteers. And so set your expectations accordingly, right? Like in terms of building new features and being responsive to support and that kind of stuff, like there's a big gap there. It's really big, and I think most people don't see it. So that would be my ask.
And as always, when we tell people to go support, especially if you work for a company that does donation matching, make sure you let your company know where you're giving your money, and let them give their money there too. Especially as a Python developer, it's important. As we were preparing for this, we found out about packages that weren't being maintained, and a lot of it always comes down to the same thing of, hey, funding. If people are funded better, then it's easier to put things in place. And interesting enough, one of the things that we haven't really talked about were the individual contributions of detection. I know a really popular package, URLlib, one of the things that they introduced were like bug bounties. And often in the security world, bug bounties are this thing, kind of like what you were saying earlier, where like, in fact, some people created malware to try to grab bug bounties. I don't necessarily have an opinion on them because I'm not a security professional, but I think what you're suggesting is, if you are a security professional, it's important that you do participate in this, because your opinion does matter, and it gives more insight and more investment into making those decisions. It's not me just going, security good, do more security. It's no, these are the industry believed best practices, and here's how we would implement them at this smaller scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say, if anyone listening is a security professional, I would also tell them go and apply to our security dev and res job, because it's open right now. But yeah, no, I think you're on the right page.
Is there anything that you think is super important that we make sure folks know about?
No, I think we covered a lot of the big stuff, and I'd say to the listeners, like, stay tuned. There's some really cool stuff planned and in progress for PyPI, Python ecosystem, security stuff. I'm really excited about it. It's coming along, so yeah, stay tuned for all of that. We are trying to keep Python a sustainable, usable, friendly, fun, and productive ecosystem for everybody, and it's a lot of work, but I think we're doing a pretty good job. So
awesome. Well, folks, our guest has been Dustin Ingram. Again, Dustin is a security professional at Google, as well as one of the members of the PSF, as well as a maintainer of PyPI. All right. Well, I guess until next time, I'm Jay.
I'm Jon.
You've been listening to a special episode of the Python Community News. Take care.